I opened my eyes and froze. The lace of my wedding dress clung to my skin, the veil pressed tight against my hair, the bouquet shaking in my hands. Music thundered through the hall, the doors swung open, and every guest turned to watch me walk down the aisle. Déjà vu clawed at my chest, because I had lived this moment before. I remembered the vows. The kiss. The cheers that meant nothing. I remembered the man waiting for me at the altar, my groom. My executioner. In my first life, this day was the start of my end. He married me not for love, but for wealth. My dowry fattened his purse, my family name lifted his rank, and my trust made me a perfect sacrifice. Hours after the ceremony, he showed me who he really was. He flaunted his mistress, sneered at my devotion, gutted my inheritance, and left my family disgraced. When I fought back, he locked me away until I broke. I died wearing this very dress, alone, humiliated, forgotten. But now I was here again. At the altar. In the same gown. With the same man. Only this time I wasn't trembling. I wasn't blind. I wasn't his prey. His family smirked from the front row, thinking I would fall into the same trap. Guests whispered, believing this was a wedding. And he looked at me with that smug confidence, certain I was still his fool. He had no idea. I would let him slip the ring onto my finger again. I would smile and bow and swear the same vows. But every word would be a dagger. Every kiss, a curse. Every step down this aisle wasn't toward my destruction. It was toward his. Last time, I died as his bride. This time, I rise as his ruin. And when I say I do, what I really mean is, watch how fast I destroy you. I died in my wedding dress. The silk was soaked with tears and the scent of roses clung to me even as my body went cold. He stood over me, the man I had once thought was my salvation, sneering as if my end was nothing more than an inconvenience. He had gotten what he wanted, my dowry, my family name, my inheritance, and now I was just a broken ornament tossed aside. I remembered his mistress laughing as I begged for an explanation, remembered the way his family looked at me like I was a fool they had always known would fall. Locked in a hidden chamber, starved of dignity and hope, I had wasted away until the only sound left was my own heartbeat sputtering to silence. That was how my first life ended, forgotten, humiliated, still draped in white. But when I opened my eyes, I was standing again, the weight of a veil pressing against my hair, a bouquet trembling in my hands. Music filled the hall. The doors were opening. The guests were rising from their seats. And at the altar stood him. My groom. My executioner. My breath caught, but this time it wasn't fear, it was fire. I knew what was about to happen. I knew every word, every glance, every smirk he and his family would exchange. I knew of the mistress hidden in the shadows, of the fortune he would steal, of the trap that would destroy me. But I also knew something else. I wasn't here to repeat history. I was here to end his. The first time I had walked down this aisle, I had been nervous, trembling like a lamb dressed for slaughter. My smile had been soft, my hands clumsy, my heart open and foolish. This time, I forced my lips into the same gentle curve, but inside, I was sharpening every vow into a blade. The guests whispered, watching me with envy, believing this was the happiest day of my life. They didn't know that they were witnessing the beginning of his funeral. Step by step, I walked down the aisle, and though the dress weighed heavy, though the memories burned like acid, I kept my gaze fixed on him. He smiled that practiced smile, the one that had fooled me before. Now I saw it for what it was, mockery. He thought I was still blind, still naive, still willing to hand him my life. I let him think it. I let everyone think it. That was the beauty of my second chance. No one would ever suspect that beneath this gown was not a blushing bride but an executioner waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The vows began, and with each line, I remembered the way I had spoken them once before, voice trembling with devotion. For better or worse. Back then, I had believed it meant loyalty. Now, I understood it meant endurance, the endurance to smile as I planned his downfall. In sickness and in health. He had left me to rot. This time I would leave him to ruin. Until death do us part. Yes, death. But his, not mine. When the ring slid onto my finger, I felt not the weight of chains but the satisfaction of a shackle I would one day use against him. The kiss that sealed our fate was bitter, but I let him taste the same lips he would soon curse. The ceremony ended, the applause thundered, and I bowed my head like the perfect bride. Inside, my mind was already calculating. I knew where his ledgers were hidden, I knew which servants had taken bribes, I knew which allies would crumble if nudged in the right direction. I had walked this path before, but now it was mine to control. I didn't need swords or poison. I had something better, memory. Knowledge of every betrayal, every lie, every secret. And I would use it all. That night, as the guests drank and celebrated, I sat by his side, smiling at his every word, laughing at his every joke. To them, I looked like the picture of a devoted bride. To him, I looked like a conquered prize. But in truth, I was neither. I was a storm waiting for the right moment to break. He didn't notice how I watched his hand linger on the wine glass, how I counted the glances he threw toward the door where his mistress lurked. He didn't notice how I studied the faces of his allies, cataloging every expression, every whisper, every weakness. He thought he was the predator. He thought I was still his prey. But as the night wore on, and the veil slipped from my hair, and the candles burned low, I whispered to myself words no one else could hear. Last time, I died as his bride. This time, I rise as his ruin. And he would never see it coming. The morning after the wedding I woke to the same room, the same bed, the same man breathing beside me, and it should have been suffocating. Last time I had been terrified, clinging to the illusion of love while he was already planning how to strip me bare of dignity and fortune. This time I forced my body to lie still, my face to remain soft, and my eyes to flutter open with the sweetness of a devoted bride. He turned to me, his lips curving into the smile that once melted my heart but now looked like the sneer of a vulture circling its prey. I whispered good morning, my voice dripping with the same innocence he expected, but inside I was laughing at how easily he believed the mask. I knew his next moves because I had lived them. He would soon begin siphoning off my dowry, weaving excuses through his business dealings, making me feel complicit in every loss until I was blamed. He would slip away to meet his mistress, emboldened by the idea that I was too meek to challenge him. He would speak to his family in coded words, painting me as a burden, as a fool, until their contempt was sharpened into knives. But this time I wouldn't wait. I began my day by memorizing the room, where he kept his keys, where he stored his ledgers, where the letters were discarded in haste. Every detail mattered. I had once walked through this house blind, but now every corner whispered secrets I could weaponize. When his mother entered, eyes sharp with judgment, I lowered mine and played the part of the humble bride. She offered words that sounded like praise but dripped with scorn, and I smiled as if I did not hear the venom. I remembered how last time I had let her break me with those words, how I had tried desperately to win her approval. Not this time. Approval was useless. What I needed was her underestimation. If she thought me harmless, she would never notice the strings I pulled beneath her nose. At breakfast he spoke of numbers and accounts, pretending to be generous as he explained how he would handle my inheritance. I nodded, feigning relief, but in truth I recalled every ledger he kept hidden in his office, every transaction he made with partners who would one day abandon him. I remembered the names of those partners, the debts he owed, the bribes he paid. Knowledge was a dagger and I had an arsenal of it. Later, when he left for his supposed business meetings, I watched him kiss my hand and leave with that smug glint in his eyes. I already knew the truth, that he was headed to her. The mistress. In my first life the discovery of her had shattered me, left me sobbing in the dark as I questioned why I wasn't enough. Now I saw her for what she was, not a rival but a tool. She thought she had stolen him, but in truth she was a pawn he would discard as soon as her usefulness ended. I planned to reach her before that could happen, to whisper truths she wasn't ready to hear, to guide her rage where I needed it to strike. But that moment would come later. For now, I turned to the servants. In my first life many of them had betrayed me for coin or favor, spreading lies about my arrogance and coldness. This time I sought them out, smiling, kind, attentive. I remembered which ones had broken most easily and which ones had wavered in loyalty. A gentle word here, a subtle kindness there, and I began weaving them into my side. Information was power, and they were my new messengers. By nightfall I had spoken little, done less, and yet already the pieces of my plan were shifting into place. He believed me blind. His family believed me meek. The guests who visited believed me a girl lucky to have been chosen. But inside, I was counting the hours. I thought of the first cracks I could open, whispers at dinners, doubts planted in the ears of his allies, the smallest truths twisted into poisonous rumors. I thought of how easily his empire could crumble if the right people began to question his competence. And I thought of the mistress, still smiling in the shadows, not knowing that soon she would be the blade I turned against him. I lay in bed once more beside him, the weight of his arm across me like a chain, and yet I smiled. Last time that arm had crushed me, this time it was nothing but a tether to drag him down. He would never see it until it was too late. And as I closed my eyes I whispered silently to the darkness, let him play his games, because mine had already begun. The days after the wedding became a stage and I played my role flawlessly, the obedient bride at her husband's side, my smile practiced, my voice sweet, my eyes lowered as if I was still dazzled by the illusion of love. To him I was harmless, a prize safely locked in his grasp, and that was the first mistake I let him make. In my first life I had clung to those vows, believed every word I had spoken with trembling sincerity, but now each promise that had once bound me became a weapon I turned inward against him. For better or worse was no longer a pledge of loyalty but a private declaration that I would endure his downfall until the final breath left his lungs. In sickness and in health was my reminder that he had abandoned me when I needed him most, and now I would stand by his side only to watch his strength decay. Until death do us part no longer meant my death, it meant his ruin. The irony of it burned in my chest as I stood beside him at gatherings, his hand possessive on my arm, his smile gleaming as he boasted of the fortune that was mine by birth. I let him speak, let him show off, and when it was my turn I leaned into the role of the doting wife, delivering words laced with venom so subtle no one could trace the cut. At a dinner arranged with his business allies, I lifted my glass and praised his ambition, but I did it with a softness that suggested recklessness. I recounted a story of how generous he was with money, how freely he spent without counting, how confident he seemed that fortune would always replenish itself. The laughter around the table was warm, but I watched the flicker of doubt in the eyes of men who had lent him gold, men who whispered of debts when the candles burned low. He smiled at me proudly, too blind to see I had cracked the first stone in his foundation. Later that evening, I made my way through the crowd, touching hands, whispering pleasantries, planting seeds of suspicion in voices that would spread them faster than I ever could. Back in the privacy of his estate, I continued my silent work. I remembered where his ledgers were hidden, how he left keys on the mantel when he drank too much wine, how careless he became when he thought me too delicate to understand. Every night after he fell asleep I crept from the bed, memorizing numbers, tracing debts, cataloging every partner and creditor. In my first life these figures had meant nothing to me until it was too late, but now I saw how fragile his empire truly was, propped up on loans and promises, a tower waiting for the right push to collapse. The knowledge pulsed in my veins like fire. And then there was the mistress. I knew he slipped away to see her, hiding behind excuses of late business, but I let him think I was oblivious. I pretended to kiss him goodbye, to wait patiently for his return, but in truth I counted the hours and studied his routes. I remembered the exact day in my first life when she had revealed herself to me, her laughter cruel as she dangled her hold over him. This time I planned to reach her before she reached me. She thought she was winning, but I would twist her pride into fury and set her against him at the moment of my choosing. For now, I let the game simmer, letting him bask in his illusion of control. The family was no different. His mother's sharp eyes followed me at every turn, her words dripping with criticism dressed as advice. Once those words had pierced me, left me desperate to prove myself, but this time I welcomed her scorn. Every insult she spat only convinced her further that I was weak, that I was incapable of outwitting them. The more convinced they were, the easier it would be to move unseen. His brothers mocked me, his sisters whispered, and I smiled through it all, cataloging every sneer, every careless secret spilled in my presence. They thought me irrelevant, and that blindness would destroy them alongside him. One evening, during another gathering, I stood by his side as he boasted of an upcoming investment. He puffed his chest, described profits yet to come, and I clapped politely before adding in a voice just loud enough to carry, "He has always been so confident, never worrying about risks." The pause that followed was brief, almost invisible, but I saw the way a few men shifted uncomfortably, already calculating how much they had entrusted to him. He did not notice, too consumed by his own pride. I leaned closer, kissed his cheek, and let the guests see nothing but devotion. Behind my smile, I was pulling the first thread from his carefully woven mask. At night, when the house was silent, I lay awake and planned my next steps. The vows I had spoken echoed in my head, but no longer as chains. They were daggers, each word sharpened by memory, each promise reversed into a curse he had no idea hung over his head. I would not rush. Revenge was not a blade to be swung recklessly, it was poison, meant to seep slowly, to rot the target from within until they begged for death. He thought me conquered, bound to him by holy vows, but I knew the truth. The wedding had not bound me to him. It had bound him to me. And soon the only vow that would matter was mine: "I will watch you fall." I moved through the days as if I were still the same bride he believed me to be, quiet and pliant, sweet with my smiles and soft with my words, yet every moment was spent collecting pieces of his downfall. In my first life I had wandered these halls blind, thinking this house was mine, thinking his family would one day embrace me, thinking he would protect me, but now I saw clearly. Every room contained evidence, every servant a witness, every gesture of his a slip I could use. At breakfast he laughed too loudly about money, about the way he had secured new opportunities with the weight of my dowry, and I leaned in as if enthralled while memorizing the names of those partners. I had seen those names before, seen how quickly they abandoned him when the debts mounted, seen how little loyalty they had when rivals offered safer harbor. This time I would not wait for fate to unravel his empire. I would be the one pulling the threads. In the afternoons I made myself small, slipping past him unnoticed, learning which servants could be turned with kindness. A maid who once whispered cruel rumors about me had a sick brother in need of medicine, and I pressed a vial into her hand without asking for repayment. Her loyalty bent toward me instantly, and by nightfall she was already passing me scraps of information she overheard. A guard who once took bribes from his family found his coin pouch heavier after I accidentally dropped a few pieces where he would find them, and soon his reports were being delivered to me before anyone else. It did not take swords or threats to turn the household, it took quiet generosity, quiet strength, and the memory of every betrayal that once crushed me. He still slipped away at night, thinking me too trusting to ask questions. I kissed his cheek and let him go, though I knew exactly where his steps were leading. In my first life the discovery of her had shattered me, left me crawling through the dark begging for answers, but this time I was not broken. I was patient. I remembered the mistress's face, remembered the smugness in her smile as she flaunted her place in his life, remembered the cruelty in her words when she mocked me as unworthy. Soon I would confront her, but not with tears. This time I would plant my words like knives in her chest, twist her pride into fury, and aim her rage directly at him. But it was not time yet. A weapon left too long in its sheath loses its edge. She would be more useful when his allies began to question him, when his family started to whisper about weakness, when one scandal could ignite the entire structure into flames. Until then, I let him kiss me with lips that already tasted of her and smiled as if I believed his lies. The family continued their subtle torments, unaware I was counting every slight. His mother's voice dripped with disdain as she reminded me of my duties, his sisters mocked the way I spoke, his brothers laughed behind their hands, and I accepted it all with a sweetness that only deepened their belief that I was harmless. Let them think it. Let them underestimate me. The more invisible I became, the easier it would be to strike when the moment came. Already I had begun weaving doubts into the fabric of society. At dinners I praised him too openly, in ways that hinted at recklessness rather than strength. At luncheons I mentioned his generosity with money, carefully choosing words that sounded like admiration but rang as warnings in the ears of men who had already risked too much on him. The shift was small, almost imperceptible, but I saw it. I saw the flickers of doubt, the quick glances, the tightening of lips when his name was spoken. Whispers travel faster than daggers, and I had just given them wind. At night, when he returned from his so-called business with the scent of another woman still clinging to him, I lay beside him as if none of it mattered. He believed I was blinded by love, and that was his second mistake. The truth was, I saw everything more clearly than he ever could. I was no longer the bride who trembled under his shadow. I was the shadow itself, patient and inevitable, waiting for the moment he would realize that his empire, his pride, his life, was already rotting from the inside. And the hand that held the poison was mine. The mask of devotion never slipped, not once, even as I stood beside him at gatherings where the powerful watched and judged every breath. He loved to parade me as his conquest, the beautiful bride whose family name had lifted him, the wealthy wife whose dowry lined his pockets, and I clapped politely at every boast while the guests sipped their wine and whispered. My revenge was not to scream or accuse, it was to guide those whispers until they became knives against his throat. At a banquet filled with his allies, I raised my glass and thanked him for his courage in investing so boldly, adding that I admired how he never hesitated even when the risks were high. Laughter rippled around us, but I saw the calculation in the eyes of men who had entrusted him with their fortunes. It was not praise I had given but poison, disguised as loyalty. He kissed my hand, thinking I adored him, never realizing I had just sown doubt where it mattered most. The more he bragged, the more I gently exaggerated, painting him as reckless without ever saying the word. His pride made him blind, and I used that blindness to turn his own allies against him. Behind closed doors, I tightened the net. The servants, once bribed to betray me, now whispered in my ear instead. They delivered letters before he could read them, they repeated conversations I was never meant to hear, they told me which merchants he quarreled with and which creditors pressed for payment. I did not need to invent his ruin, he had already built it himself, with debts and arrogance. All I had to do was pull the right thread at the right moment. And then there was the mistress. He still slipped away, thinking I was too simple to notice, but each time he left, I marked the hour, the path, the excuse he gave. I knew her arrogance would make her reckless, and I was ready to turn that recklessness into scandal. Not yet. Timing was everything. One whisper too early and he would cover his tracks. One word too late and the chance would vanish. I waited, sharpening the blade in silence. At another dinner his family watched me with narrowed eyes. His mother sneered when I praised him, his sister smirked when I laughed at his jokes, his brothers mocked me when they thought I could not hear. In my first life I had tried desperately to win them, to earn affection that never came, and their rejection had shattered me. Now I let their contempt wash over me like smoke. They believed me powerless, and that was the opening I needed. Already their arrogance made them careless. His sister confessed to a friend about debts she hid, his brother joked too loudly about cheating games, and I smiled sweetly as I listened, memorizing it all. Their own secrets would destroy them alongside him, and they had just handed me the keys. One evening, while he boasted of an upcoming venture, I leaned in with what looked like admiration and asked if he would finally take a moment to rest once it succeeded. He laughed and declared that success was endless, that money always flowed when he commanded it. The room erupted in polite applause, but I saw the stiffness in shoulders, the brief frowns on faces that knew the truth, that money never flowed endlessly, that even the proudest man could drown in debt. By the time dessert was served, whispers were already traveling down the table, and I sat with lowered lashes, the image of the perfect bride, while inside I smiled. At night I lay beside him, listening to his steady breathing, his body heavy with the arrogance of victory, and I stared at the ceiling with cold clarity. The cracks were spreading. His allies were beginning to doubt, his family had grown careless, and his mistress was waiting in the shadows, blind to the way I would use her. In my first life I had been the one unraveling while he thrived. In this life it was reversed. He still believed he was the predator, but every whisper, every rumor, every glance of suspicion in the eyes of his partners told me the truth. The hunt had already begun, and this time I was the one closing in. The mistress finally stepped into the light, just as I knew she would. In my first life her presence had shattered me, her laughter had cut deeper than any blade, but this time I was waiting. She thought herself victorious, strutting into the halls of my marriage with the arrogance of someone who believed she had stolen the heart of a man worth keeping. She whispered cruel words where she thought I would hear, mocking my devotion, flaunting the way he came to her when he claimed to be working. And I smiled. I smiled as if I were too naive to understand, smiled as if her jabs had found their mark, smiled because her arrogance was the rope she was tightening around her own neck. I sought her out one evening, not with rage but with calm precision. I spoke gently, as if I were a wounded wife confessing her fears, and I told her fragments of truths she had never considered. I told her he had laughed about her once behind closed doors, calling her a passing amusement. I told her he had spoken of marrying higher if he tired of her. I told her he used her name in business dealings only to discard the blame when they soured. None of it was a lie. I had seen it all happen in my first life. Her pride cracked, fury sparking in her eyes, and I knew I had planted the first seed. She would not strike immediately, but she would strike, and when she did it would be in public, where his allies and family would see, where his mask would slip and his control would falter. While she stewed in growing anger, I tightened my grip on society. At luncheons I remained the devoted wife, but my words carried edges only the keen would notice. I praised him for his confidence even in the face of setbacks, as if hinting at failures he had not spoken of. I complimented his generosity with investments, as if implying recklessness. And each time I saw a flicker of doubt, I pressed deeper. The whispers grew. Merchants wondered if his pockets were as deep as he claimed. Partners whispered about debts that had gone unpaid. Even his family began to question him behind closed doors, though to his face they still smiled. He had built his image on pride and wealth, and both were beginning to crack. The servants, now loyal to me, brought me letters he had written in haste, numbers that revealed his growing desperation. He was borrowing more, stretching further, gambling that he could win before anyone noticed. But people had noticed. I had made sure of it. At a grand dinner I guided the mistress into his path, encouraging her with subtle words until her anger spilled. She accused him in front of guests, her voice sharp, her fury uncontrolled. Gasps echoed through the hall as she revealed his infidelity, his lies, his arrogance. In my first life I had been destroyed by this moment. This time I stood silent, eyes wide, lips trembling as if heartbroken, the picture of the wronged wife. Sympathy washed toward me like a tide, while he scrambled to control the damage. He snarled at her, tried to deny, but the crowd had already chosen their side. By the end of the night his reputation was bleeding. The mistress stormed out, humiliated, and though she thought she had ruined me, she had only played the role I set for her. The guests whispered of his cruelty, of his betrayal, of how fortunate I was to endure with such grace. Allies turned cold, friends drifted away, and his empire groaned under the weight of suspicion. I walked beside him as he seethed, his grip tight on my arm, his fury barely contained, and I lowered my gaze as if I feared him. Inside I burned with triumph. He still thought he controlled me, but in truth I had just used his own mistress to slice the first deep wound in his pride. And the deeper the cut, the faster the blood would flow. This was only the beginning. His empire began to crumble piece by piece, just as I remembered, but this time I was the one guiding every collapse. Partners who had once boasted of their faith in him now hesitated to return his calls, creditors pressed harder for payment, and merchants who once fawned at his name began to whisper that his fortune was thinner than he claimed. I did not need to shout or scheme wildly, I simply nudged what was already weak, and the structure collapsed under its own weight. At night he paced his study, rifling through ledgers, muttering about loyalty and betrayal, while I lingered at the door with soft words of comfort. He thought me devoted, thought my touch was reassurance, thought I was blind to the numbers that burned in front of him. But I remembered those numbers, every debt, every unpaid loan, every failed venture, because I had lived them once before, and I knew exactly which cracks to press. I began redirecting my dowry quietly, investing through names he would not recognize, strengthening his rivals with coin that should have been his. He never suspected, too certain that I was ignorant of money and power. Each coin I moved was another stone pulled from beneath his feet. Society began to turn. Invitations that once poured in became scarce, allies excused themselves from dinners, conversations hushed when we approached. He raged behind closed doors, slamming his fist against the table, spitting curses about betrayal. He accused his partners of weakness, his family of sabotage, his mistress of betrayal, never once suspecting the bride at his side. And all the while I smiled sweetly, lowered my eyes, and whispered that I believed in him. It was delicious to watch him cling to my supposed devotion while the walls caved in. His family began to shift too. His mother, once cruel in her disdain, now eyed me with suspicion, as if she could sense something she couldn't prove. His brothers grew restless as their own comforts wavered, his sisters whispered about finding more secure marriages. They had once laughed at me, mocked me, treated me as nothing, but now they looked at me with the unease of people who realized the floor beneath them was rotting. The mistress, discarded and furious, spread her venom wherever she could, revealing secrets she thought would hurt me but only cut him deeper. She had nothing left to lose, and I had given her the push she needed to destroy him publicly. Every rumor she spread was true, and the more she raged, the more the world turned against him. I did not silence her, I fed her. A word here, a suggestion there, enough to fuel her fire without ever dirtying my own hands. He had turned her into a weapon against me in my first life. Now I had turned her into the weapon that carved his downfall. When creditors arrived demanding payment he could not provide, I stood silently by his side as he lied, promising wealth that no longer existed. When partners withdrew, I watched him sputter and beg, his pride unraveling in front of men who once feared him. And when he finally returned home in defeat, I greeted him with a soft smile, hands folded, the perfect picture of loyalty. He still thought I belonged to him. He still thought he could command me, own me, break me. But every word I spoke, every gentle touch, every glance was another chain I wrapped around him. He believed I was his anchor. In truth I was the weight dragging him into the depths. The empire he had built on arrogance and deceit was rotting faster than he could repair. And soon the collapse would be complete. The night he thought would be his final triumph was the night I chose to reveal myself. He had summoned his remaining allies to a grand feast, desperate to prove he still held power, that the whispers of his collapse were nothing but lies. He dressed me in jewels bought with money he no longer had, placed me at his side as if my presence could convince the world he was still untouchable. I played my role, smiling sweetly, raising my glass, pretending to beam with pride as he boasted of deals secured and profits yet to come. But I could see the doubt in the eyes of the guests, the stiffness of their smiles, the way they shifted in their seats as if already distancing themselves from a man they knew was drowning. And when the last toast was raised, when the candles flickered low and his arrogance swelled at its peak, I struck. I rose from my seat, the perfect bride, and thanked everyone for coming to honor my husband. My voice was soft, calm, dripping with admiration, yet each word was a blade. I spoke of his endless courage in taking risks others would never dare, of his generosity in spending freely, of his conviction that debts were merely opportunities waiting to be conquered. A ripple of unease spread through the hall as I listed every reckless act he thought hidden. His allies shifted, murmured, their doubts confirmed by the wife who was supposed to shield him. He laughed at first, tried to turn it into a joke, but when I laid the documents on the table, ledgers copied in secret, contracts he had forged, letters he had burned, silence crushed the room. One by one the men who had supported him stood, their faces cold, their alliances severed. He turned on me then, eyes blazing with fury, his mask slipping in front of the very people who once adored him. He hissed accusations, called me a traitor, demanded to know how I had these records, but the more he raged the smaller he looked, no longer a man of power but a desperate fool exposed in his own hall. I did not raise my voice. I did not scream or cry as I had in my first life. I simply looked at him, steady and unbroken, and told him the truth. That I had been his greatest mistake. That every cruelty he inflicted, every betrayal he thought hidden, every humiliation he forced upon me had become the knowledge I used to destroy him. He had forged me into the weapon of his own ruin. The guests left one by one, their silence louder than any words. His allies abandoned him that night, his family fled the shame, his name became poison. When the hall was empty, when the candles guttered out, he sank into his chair, face pale, hands trembling over the ruins of his empire. He tried to curse me, tried to strike me, but the strength was gone. I stood above him in my wedding gown, the same gown I had died in once before, and I looked at him not with fear but with satisfaction. He had wanted a bride to break. What he had gotten was a bride reborn to bury him. That night was not a wedding night. It was his execution, and I was the one who delivered the sentence. Dawn broke over a house that no longer belonged to him. The halls that once echoed with his arrogance were silent, the servants avoiding his gaze, the family scattered, the allies gone. He sat slumped in his study, surrounded by ledgers that no longer held meaning, his hands clutching at useless scraps of paper as if numbers could save him now. He looked smaller than I remembered, no longer the man who had sneered down at me as I died in my first life, no longer the husband who had paraded his mistress while I begged for dignity. He was just a broken shell in the ruins of his own making. I stood in the doorway in my wedding dress, the gown heavy with memories, the veil trailing like a shadow. He looked up at me then, and for the first time I saw fear in his eyes. Not anger, not mockery, not control, fear. He whispered my name as if it could bind me to him, as if saying it could undo everything I had done, but names had lost their power. He had taken mine when he tried to erase me. Now I stood before him nameless, faceless, untouchable, the embodiment of the justice he never believed would come. I told him what he had never wanted to hear, that everything he had destroyed in me had been rebuilt sharper, harder, stronger. That the bride he thought weak had been the one to end him. That every vow I had spoken on that altar had come true, only twisted to my design. I had stayed with him for better and for worse, only the worse was his. I had stood by him in sickness and in health, only the sickness was the rod of his empire. And I had kept the final vow, until death do us part, only the death was his pride, his power, his life as he knew it. His lips trembled, his body shook, and for the first time I saw him grasp the truth. That his ruin had not come from enemies outside, but from the woman he thought conquered. I left him there, surrounded by the ashes of everything he had ever stolen. I walked out through the grand doors still dressed in white, the gown no longer a shroud of humiliation but a banner of victory. The guests who had whispered about me now bowed their heads as I passed, the servants who had once betrayed me now lowered their eyes in awe, the world that had mocked me now knew my strength. Each step was heavy with the past, but lighter with every stride into the future. I did not look back. He was finished, and I had no need to watch a dead man drown. The sun caught the veil as it fluttered behind me, and I thought of the girl I had been, trembling and naive, walking down this aisle once to meet her end. Now I walked it again, reborn, not as a bride, not as a victim, but as the woman who turned her wedding into his funeral. And as the doors closed behind me, I swore silently that I would never let anyone bind me again. This time I was not the bride walking toward destruction. I was the bride who had walked away in victory, leaving him to choke on the ruins of everything he once thought untouchable.